I'm the CEO of BridgeUSA. Monica, you want to quickly?
I'm Mónica Guzmán. I'm Senior Fellow for Public Practice at Braver Angels.
Okay, and basically, we're going to get into the talk. I just want to give you a quick structure. For the first 15-ish minutes, Monica and I each are going to talk quickly about our stories, why we do this work. I promise you we're not actually building literal bridges. We're building figurative ones, and we'll get into that. And we'll sort of hook up with a lot of the talks that happen in the morning. And then for 30 minutes, we'll do some questions back and forth, and then really focus on you all and those in the online audience. Get some of your questions and really make this interactive, especially since it's a more intimate group. So we're gonna get into that. All right, sounds good. So you wanna kick us off?
Yeah. So the thing that I am so motivated by these days is that across all these issues, across America, across all different kinds of people, we are so divided, we're blinded. We're not seeing our way to each other because it's getting increasingly difficult to even see who each other is, what each other really believes, and why. And we're also therefore not seeing the debates for what they really are. We're not seeing the contours of the debates clearly and reasonably. So I am at Braver Angels. What is that? Braver Angels is the nation's largest cross-partisan grassroots organization committed to political depolarization. Easy stuff. Extremely tall order, but lots of progress. Almost 100 alliances and chapters all across the country. There's local Braver Angels right here in Vermont. And we've got politicians taking workshops and their staffs learning how to build bridges with their constituents. It's exciting. It's really pretty great. But what brought me to this work? There's a couple of threads. The first is somewhat professional. I've been a journalist my whole career. I joined Braver Angels just a couple years ago. And as a journalist, I find it mission critical to help people understand each other. That's the point, right? I've worked at the Houston Chronicle in Texas. I've worked in Michigan, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. I've created my own publication. But the goal has always been help people understand each other. And what I realized 5-10 years ago was that it wasn't enough for me to just do my best to tell people stories responsibly in the media. There was this foundational brokenness and division and toxic polarization that meant that no matter how many stories I told or how well I thought I was telling them, it seemed like we're still just spinning further apart. So I realized that if the reason I'm doing this is to help people understand each other, I need to take a step back from just journalism and storytelling and work on that foundational brokenness. But the other big thread that's led me to this work is a lot more personal. So I am a Mexican immigrant. I'm the daughter of Mexican immigrants as well. And I voted for Biden and Hillary Clinton in the last 2 presidential elections. And my parents voted both times enthusiastically for Donald Trump. We became citizens at the same time in the year 2000. I was 17, so I was automatically naturalized when my parents passed that test. So pretty near each other, we began to vote, almost like together, pretty close. And the political conversations began immediately, because this is a country we adopted. This is the country we chose. And it was shocking to me at the time that they were Republicans. It shouldn't have been shocking to me. I just figured, I don't know, all Mexican immigrants are Democrats, right? Yeah, sure. We had so many contentious, wildly heated conversations. And then with the 2016 presidential campaign, it just spiked. And yet, despite all the yelling, there was a lot of understanding. And I can say that I understand their reasons for voting for Trump to such a degree that if I were them, I would have voted for Trump too. And they believe the same about me and my decisions to vote for the candidates I voted for. So I saw that happening at the same time as I was seeing so much tear us apart nationally. And coming back to this idea that when we are so divided, we stop being able to see each other. We stop being able to see the whole. We're so polarized, we're paralyzed. I think we can all feel that. Whether it's climate, sustainability, guns, immigration, abortion, there's a dysfunction that just brings us to this stuck place where everything is reactionary and where vilification happens all the time. So the last thing I'll say is, over the last several years too, I started to just get obsessed with this problem. Started to do a lot of research into what it is that's dividing us and what we can do. What is it about the conversations with my parents? Or what is it about anybody who's been able somehow, miraculously, to have these conversations at a time where so many have given up on them? What is it about those conversations that works? And so last year, I published my book, which is called I Never Thought of It That Way: How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. And thanks to that, I've been traveling the country, learning from and speaking with and learning with folks who know that something's gotta change because we are breaking ourselves more and more.
That's awesome. Thank you, Monica. And I just want to, I should save the round of applause, actually. One other thing Monica's super humble. Her book that you launched last year is actually a bestseller on lots of different topics. So thank you for all you do. So for my introduction, I'll be honest. I have no interest in politics. I was born in central New Jersey, in New Brunswick. I moved around a bunch. I lived in India with my grandparents for a while. Came back to the U.S. I never lived in a place for more than 2 years. I came to college. I went to school on the West Coast. And politics was this foreign thing to me. If you had asked me what democracy is, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. And actually, I want to shift a little bit of what I was going to say, because I never usually use paper during these things, but I was taking so many notes on the introductory 3 folks that were there. Oh, yeah. Jeremy, Taylor, and I'm forgetting the last gentleman's name, but they are bridge builders. And what you're probably asking yourself is, what is bridge building? What does that mean? So one of the things that Jeremy talked about was he's figuring out how to take climate sustainability, specifically the issue of plant-based options, to people that would never think about plant-based options. He's building a bridge to folks that would never understand and believe in what he's doing. Taylor has a basketball league where the basketball itself, which he doesn't care about, is a bridge between the policing community and African-American men in his town. That's bridge building. My story, Monica, when we often talk, is a weird one because, again, I was a pre-med student. I was interested in being a doctor. As an Indian person, there's 2 accepted career paths. You could be a doctor, an engineer. And then if you go a little crazy, you might be a lawyer, And I was nonprofits. And I remember second semester of my freshman year at Berkeley with this speaker by the name of Milo Yiannopoulos come to campus. How many folks have heard of this guy named Milo? He's kind of dropped off the map a little bit. Okay, some people. Those are your political nerds, by the way, in the audience. So Milo shows up, right? And I'm walking back from my math seminar, and these helicopters fly overhead. And there's shouting and violence in the distance. And I'm okay, well, Berkeley protests everything. We protest big things, small things. We're just out there protesting. Turns out that those were actually the largest free speech protests in Berkeley's history since the 60s. I remember walking past a cafe, and the window was broken in. And inside there was a TV screen. It said CNN, UC Berkeley students protesting free speech. Now, again, I was this tiny freshman, did not understand what free speech was, did not know what protests were, and also did not know who Milo was. But what I did know, as you talk about being a Mexican immigrant, my family came from India. What I did know was that doesn't belong in a democracy. Violence to meet each other is not the way to move forward. As I think Taylor said, and I actually took down this quote from him, which is, what he saw was he watched humanity at its best from people who don't look like me. On that day, I saw humanity at its worst. And not the protesters. That's not what I'm saying politically. What I'm saying is I saw us give into our anxiety and into our fear and into our pain on both sides. And so the next day, me and some random people got together, and we just created a space for us to listen, students. And we called it Bridge Berkeley. That was it. Some people on campus thought we were a civic architecture frat. They were building bridges. And that discussion space grew and grew. And then it turned into this thing called Bridge Notre Dame. And then we had students from Colorado Boulder. They created a space called BridgeUSA Boulder. Literally, conversations, not compromise, understanding each other, not giving in, empathizing rather than excluding. Not just conservatives and liberals, but black students and Indian students and immigrants. And we kept holding these spaces, and over time, we had this organization called BridgeUSA, which is, alongside Braver Angels, one of the largest organizations figuring out how we get young people to have conversations across lines of difference. And I'll end with this before we get into our sort of back and forth to really get into how we build an effective multicultural democracy, is that I fundamentally believe that we're at this unique moment in our society where we often hear the work of bridge building and listening to each other and talking to each other, and we think, well, that's just kumbaya. That's just sitting around in a circle and not really getting anywhere. Well, I took some notes on Jeremy and Taylor's presentation specifically. And one thing that Jeremy said was, be realistic about the problem. Be realistic about the problem. We live in a country with people that are different, people with different cultures, different ideas, different backgrounds. In fact, I would say that we live in the most ambitious, not worst, not greatest, most ambitious experiment in the history of humanity. By 2050, we will be the most diverse democracy the world has ever seen. That's profound. That is difficult. But if we're being realistic, the only way we make that experiment proceed and continue is by being able to equip people to be bridge builders. And second, my friend Taylor, he said, we need to lead with community, with empathy, and with humanity. You know, right now, Monica, I know you're much more active than me on social, but I know one of the things that we found is that we are incentivized to divide. We're incentivized to lead with exclusion. If you wanted to make the most amount of friends right now, you go and shout. But what does that get us? It goes exactly to what Jeremy was talking about early in the morning. All that gets us is that just the vegans are eating the burgers. Mm-hmm. What we need is we need the guy driving the pickup truck to also eat the burger. In our case, we got to get everybody bought in on this concept. And so I'm excited to talk about and spend the next 30 minutes thinking through how we build bridges, not so that we can compromise, but so that we can understand. Not so that we can be closed-minded, but so that we can be open-minded. Not so that we live within our labels, but we live for each other. And I think that's super important. So let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, I've heard folks at Sea Change talk about the umbrella over everything, that there's a focus here on climate sustainability. There's lots of issues that are important, but there's this umbrella of our democracy, our deliberative society, staying healthy, making it possible for persuasion to be effective, right? For trust to build and sustain all these debates that we're gonna have to make sure everyone's coming along. There was another quote I wrote down from Jeremy's presentation where he said, he talked about the folks who come up to Moonburger and get their burger. And he said there was nothing prejudicial that kept them from pulling up. They tried it, they liked it, and they came back. So what does bridge building really have to do specifically with these issues that so many folks here care about? How do we bring that wisdom, and why ought we, into climate sustainability?
Yeah. Well, let me actually ask, how many folks in the room work on climate or sustainability issues, just so that I can get an understanding? What do folks work on? Just shout it out. What is your issue or your thing of interest? What do you care about?
Climate change, water conservation.
Okay.
Ocean health.
Cool. What about y'all?
Regenerative farming.
Regenerative farming?
Yep.
What do y'all like to do or think about? Upcycling? Okay. Cool.
Related.
Anybody else? Jeff, what do you care about?
Rethinking how we approach waste.
Okay. So to your question directly, when we think about waste, or we think about upcycling, or we think about climate health, my bold belief and statement is that I don't think we can achieve progress to the degree we need to achieve progress on any of those issues without adopting a new and more aspirational lens of thinking about the world. And that is what we call bridge building. Here's what we mean by that. Some of my best friends, I'm 24, so a lot of my Gen Z friends that are activists on different issues, climate, guns, you ask them, most folks on the question of climate will say that the resistance is only hardened on climate. That, in fact, more and more people have become obstinate to this. And in fact, the resistance is getting harder in specific areas. You talk about guns. They feel like the progress is not happening because, in fact, their activism is sometimes pushing people out. And so what we've been thinking through, Monica, is, well, what does bridge building do for some of those issues? And I think there's two things that it does. I think first, when we talk to each other and when we engage, when we listen and we have dialogues across lines of difference, what it does is it creates the conditions for progress on the issue you care about. I think it helps people be better advocates for their work. One of the coolest things that happens when students come into our discussions is they'll leave being able to articulate why they care about, let's say, immigration to somebody that might not be interested in their perspective. But the second thing it does is it allows us to understand and meet people where they are. And like that's the biggest thing is when we think about building bridges, it's ultimately you care about your issue, but what's the means to getting that issue across the finish line? So that's why I think it's relevant to a lot of the work that people, I think, care about. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean,
You've been on the road a lot last year.
I have.
Yeah.
But going off of that, there's this talk that Van Jones gave, and he's a large voice on the left, but he was talking about the work that he did on criminal justice reform with, of all people, Newt Gingrich on the right. And he was saying that as they came together and talked about things, he realized some pretty key things about what brought them to the issue. For Newt Gingrich and for the right in particular, what they saw is they saw a wasteful bureaucracy, all this money being spent on incarceration with terrible outcomes for people. And then some more faith-based conservatives were also worried about, what about second chances? What about redemption? Like, how does that work in our criminal justice system? And so those two things were bringing lots of energy from the right into solving for this issue. And then Van told him, well, from the left, it's really just one thing: justice, justice, justice. And he realized we come at this issue from completely different directions, but once they found that common goal and the common place they wanted to go, they could work together and they got a ton of stuff done, actual policy, actual change. So what he said to cap that off was, don't let the battleground obscure the common ground, which I think is just so key. And it reminds me of something I heard from a facilitator of a Braver Angels workshop. So Braver Angels workshops, skills training for crossing the political divide in particular. And he did it in this town, and there was a gentleman who was blue-leaning, so we use the terminology red for conservative, blue for Democrat-leaning. There was someone who was blue who apparently was a landlord and refused to rent to anyone red because conservatives are destroying the country and all of that. He really felt that. And so during the course of the workshop, people were paired off, blue and red, and he was paired off with someone conservative. They talked about some things. And at the end, he came up to the facilitator with tears in his eyes and said that when he was sitting with the man who was conservative, after hearing him for a while, he looked at him and he said, I disagree with everything you just said, but powerful people want us to hate each other. Let's not do it. And he told the facilitator that that was his big takeaway. So that's the other thing is like, it's hard to get to common ground or even close when we have such animosity. So bridge building is also about that. It's like, can you see your way to each other? All right, cool. Now can you see your way to the solutions?
I have a question for you, but do you mind if I share a story too?
Please.
Okay, so we actually did this with Braver Angels. So 2019 was my junior year of college at Berkeley. How many of you have been to Berkeley? Has anybody been to Berkeley? Okay. It's commonly known as the Republic of California, in case anybody was wondering. I love Berkeley. It's a fascinating place, and I remember one of the biggest challenges that town deals with is homelessness. And student homelessness especially. Believe it or not, there aren't enough dorms on campus to house students themselves. There isn't even enough cost-proof housing in the community for students. And so we held a debate where we basically had a conversation where we said, hey, let's bring the students together, let's bring the administrators together, let's talk about student homelessness. We brought everybody together, everybody sits down. We even invite the homeless folks that are protesting the construction of buildings because they have their own territory that they want to protect. So we bring all these stakeholders together. People show up at this Braver Angels debate, Monica, and they're ready to protest. They're like, yo, this is the conversation. This is not to happen. This is challenging my humanity. A lot of the criticisms that we all hold of this work. And I got really nervous. You know, I'm, again, this like tiny little like junior in college. I'm like, uh-oh. And by the end of that debate and that moderated conversation, the people that were protesting were the ones that were the most engaged. They were talking. They were like, I've got this policy idea on how the university can limit its cuts on housing policy and reduce the price. To Van's point, they figured out a way to see the trees through the forest. And that debate was profound because it actually created policy recommendations between a community that had never engaged with the administration and the university administration. They had never been in the same room together. What are we doing? And so these are the spaces and the point of context we need to create. And so I just love the work that y'all do, and that debate was a way to make that happen. So I got to ask you a question. You were on the road last year, you know, doing a lot of talks about the book. I know one of the challenges that we often get is, why are we so focused on interpersonal conversation and bridge building when there are legislative policies and things that need to happen institutionally? So how do you reconcile this need to bridge build with this sort of need that people often have to get policy action done?
Yeah.
How do you see that?
It's so interesting to hear this, what I think is a fundamental misunderstanding of conversation as just talk. It's just talk. It's not action. But what that misses is that, first of all, each conversation is completely unique, right? If you and I talk right now, it's you right now meeting me right now in this moment, in this place. It will never happen again. And every conversation, if it is really free, is organic. It's unpredictable by design. What conversation is a way for people to discover each other. And we rarely treat it that way. We rarely give it the full breadth and power of what it's capable of. When you think about the millions of micro decisions that you have to make just to hold one conversation, all the signals that you detect from somebody else. So conversation is not just talk. It builds something that is absolutely fundamental to any change or action that you want to make that affects more than just you, which is trust. And so what we have right now is a society where the well of trust is drying up. And so what do? We say, well, we need action. You know, we need to jump to the facts and the truth and let's go. And whoever doesn't agree with us is dumb and stupid and we just need to trample over them so that we can change the world the way it needs to be. But we miss so much. You know, we miss on the one hand too that, and research has shown us this over and over again, that when you share your interests, you share your blind spots too. The more that you stay in circles of like-minded people without allowing friction to enter, the more that you're going to miss a lot of evident solutions and creative directions that you're just not going to see and are not going to be there to help you. But without trust, again, people won't even come to the table, let alone find the common ground. And then if they do come to the table, they're still not going to be open to what they don't know. So I talk a lot about certainty as well, that certainty is the enemy. It's the arch-villain of curiosity. If you think you already know, you're not going to think to ask. And so we can't approach each other when we think we already know everything each other has to say. Another reason that people say, it's just talk. What's the point? I already know how terrible they are. I already know that they're no good. That whatever they have to say is not for this movement, is not for this cause. So that's the main thing, is the conversation is the means and the channel of connection. As long as there's enough curiosity, as long as people don't come in with, I'm here to prove myself, I'm here to convince the other person, I'm here to judge the other person. It goes back to that, you know, what we heard from Jeremy as well, again, about the prejudicial language. It's such a challenge right now just to get past that. So what I see in our policy is a lot of our policy right now is reactionary. It's one side, wherever it has power, moving as quickly as it can to make policy driven by fear of what the other side is doing or will do. And that is not the government we deserve. That's not the policy we deserve.
Follow-up for you, because I think about this a lot, and I have thoughts on this, which is what's the need for curiosity when, you know, there's actively people suffering at the hands of certain issues, or people often raise the question of like, why do we need to talk when we need to act? there's a clear issue happening. Take Taylor's example. We have an epidemic of gun violence in this country. There's school shootings happening. What's the point of being curious in the face of that? Why not focus on helping my side win and getting as many folks on my side to office so that I can solve that issue?
Right.
How do you think about that?
And and that's another separation people make between being a fighter, right, and having bridging conversations, as if the bridging conversations don't make you a stronger fighter. They do. When you are a fighter who is not also spending a slice of time making sure you understand the motivations and the stories of your opponents, of the folks who disagree with your course of action, then you're fighting blind. And then what do you end up doing? You make great content for social media that everyone on your side likes, but that doesn't make a difference. In fact, all it will do is entrench your opponents even more, because your opponents say they don't listen to us. Your opponents say all they want to do is fight, but they don't actually want to move forward. And then there you are, proving it over and over and over again. So that's the trench warfare we're in. And it feels good when you get those vanity metrics coming your way. It feels good when you get a lot of people to show up to the protest, right? But are you actually making an impact? Are you persuading the folks you need to persuade for like big level change? And so like what we've seen with criminal justice, we've seen with climate, we're going to hear from an organization tomorrow that you know about that's doing great work on this. But when people are able to say, wait a minute, this will make me a better advocate, this will make me a stronger advocate if I understand where people are coming from, then you can actually make real progress on the issues. And that's just what it takes. And where have you seen that? Like where does that take you?
So I'm this like crazy person that'll sometimes just go on these road trips for really long periods of time and just like talk to people. And so my most recent road trip was from Austin to Boston. Okay, it sounds like the start of a song.
Is it just because it rhymed?
No, it's not because it rhymed. It's because Austin's in the middle of the country and Boston's where my parents live. So basically, drove from Austin, Texas to Lake Charles, Louisiana, then to Meridian, Mississippi, where I hurt my knee, and so like this like lady that I did not know helped treat it, and I would have probably never interacted with her otherwise. Selma, Alabama, where Taylor was earlier this week. Then we went to Georgia. Then we went to South Carolina. Then we went up to Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is a military town. And then we went to Washington, D.C. And then we went to Boston, where I live with my parents. And everywhere we met, Monica, conservative pastors from Georgia, black activists in Selma, very liberal students in Austin, Texas. Everybody said something that fit into like 3 bullets. The first was, I want to live in a country that acknowledges that I exist. Not that hard. Second is, I want to live in a country where my kids do better than I do. And third is, I want to live in a society that's safe, that's productive, and that helps me achieve what I want to achieve. That's not a complicated task wish list. That's our politics. The amount of times, I know you see this all the time because you travel the country, the amount of times I'll come across somebody that's saying something about someone based on their label, but has never actually interacted with that person ever in their life. Like the amount of times I've heard really conservative folks in Georgia who've never been up to Washington, D.C., say crap about D.C., and at the same time, the amount of people that I've seen in D.C. that have never actually met somebody from Kansas and make judgments about them because that's easy is not only sad, but it's tragic. It's like we're living through this odd moment where we are actively giving into the powers that be that separate us. I was actually going to end with this, but I just got a quick lyric. Devin Gilfillian, who's here, y'all should check out his music. Alex knows him really well. He was playing for some of us yesterday night. One of his lyrics was, and he sang this, just as an FYI, we have to be smarter than the power separating us because we're in this shit together. So like the next time we have the assumption that that person who's under that label must believe that thing because that's what we're told to believe, that's wrong. Mm-hmm. Second question I've got for you is, why have a conversation with somebody that you think will never change their mind? Like, what's the point of that? Why do we do that? What do you think?
Well, first, if you think that they will never change their mind, that's a lot of certainty for something you can't possibly know. So that's one thing.
But it's so easy to be certain.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
the other thing is that if you're telling yourself, I don't want to have this conversation because I don't think their minds can be changed, you're also saying the only point of having this conversation would be for me to change their mind. And so question that. Get curious about that. Is that really your goal? Should that be the goal? There's a quote from Walt Whitman that Ted Lasso said in Ted Lasso. Be curious, not judgmental. If you have seen the show, there's this lovely scene with darts game that is just fantastic and worth Googling. But what I've learned too from the research is that it's actually impossible to be both curious and judgmental at the same time. These are two modes in your brain. When you are curious, the neurological thing that happens is that you have this craving for knowledge. You want to close the gap between what you know and what you want to know. And then you're just kind of taken for a ride, depending on how long that interest lasts. When you're judgmental, it's not about learning anything. You're making a declaration. Now, judgments are important, but when they're not informed, they can be pretty reckless. So across disagreement, it kind of begins with this humble admission that you don't know enough, that there might be something you're missing. And so why have the conversation with someone you don't think is going to change their mind? Because there's a lot more to do than try to persuade, and there's a lot you could be missing. What I think of as the most pernicious assumption that gets in the way of building these kinds of bridges for the good is the assumption, because they oppose what I support, they must hate what I love. I voted for this because this is incredibly important to me, and this is everything, right? So whoever doesn't vote for that must be a racist, must be just this horrible human being. And time again, right, to discover, to talk across that divide and discover that it wasn't what you thought at all. Most of the time it is not something that malevolent. And I've run into stories and stories on this. But a point that really gels for me, and I wonder how you react to this too, is just that whoever, because we are human, and no matter how, by the way, research has showed, no matter how educated you are, no matter how smart you are, or how well informed you are, how much news you read, you are not immune. It makes you no more immune to these things. Whoever is underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your imagination. You will make judgments about them based on not a whole lot, based on the signals you receive from your silos, because that's the way we're living our lives, and that's the way this world is shaping up. And we need to reverse that. Yeah. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, but it's a mindset.
There's three numbers that come to mind: 10%, 15%, and 25%. What are those numbers? 10%. 80% of all content on social media is produced by 10% of users. 15%. 15% of the US population votes in most of our primaries. And 25%. That 25% of the general population is perceived to actually be engaged in our politics. The reason why I bring those numbers up in response to what you're saying is because I personally don't think we're living through the polarization of the masses. I think we're living through the radicalization of the extremes. And here's what I mean by that. Most people, when we look at the world, are entirely being pushed through a filter of the loudest voices in society. The loudest voices. The rest of us disengage. Quick story. I remember after the Milo protests on our campus, we had a class, and the student gets up. It's a seminar of 15 folks. 15 students are there. Professor says something. Student gets up and is offended by what the professor is saying. I thought actually rightfully so. And student starts protesting the professor. This person gets up in response to the student, starts protesting the student. Students start yelling at each other. The other 13 of us, I'm like sitting there, I'm like, man, I don't think this is right. Like, I feel like we should just learn this lesson, maybe criticize the lesson in discussion. But I kept quiet because I was like, oh, like these other 12 people must also be on one side or the other. Afterwards, the professor got the other 13 of us in a room. And all 13 of us were like, actually, I didn't like that either. I was like, you didn't like that? I didn't like that. And we realized that if any one of us 13 had gotten up to those two and said, this is not the way we have this discussion. Let's actually critically engage. Let's interrogate. Let's have healthy conflict. Not kumbaya compromise, but healthy disagreement, because that's the engine of democracy. Then we'll get somewhere. But nobody said anything. And that's what I think it is I think we're living through this moment where the loudest voices are dominating, and as a result, the nuance of our lives gets totally left out. And everybody else is disengaging. Everybody else becomes the 13. And so I think fundamentally part of our job, to what Jeremy also is doing, is how do we market and show that most people in this society are willing and interested in being open-minded, that most people are probably interested in a world that acknowledges them, that most people probably want to belong to a community that's larger than themselves. How do we reach most folks with that message? That's I think, the challenge of our time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, along with fear. I talked about certainty being in the way. You know, certainty is soothing when there's so much anxiety. But fear itself, you can't wonder about something you think is out to get you. You're not going to ask questions about the bear that's chasing you down. How fuzzy is it? Who cares? I need to go. So, but the other thing that happens with fear in our society is we get less creative. And so you start to sense, I mean, one of the frustrations for me in this work is when I look around and I see the human capital that we could marshal to all these issues, right? And that's like, it's like this big, fat, stack. But then, taken through all these filters, like toxic polarization, what it does, this much productive capital comes out the other way. Drowned out by the yelling, drowned out by so much, and drowned out by the fear. Because we're just gonna run away from each other. So that's it too, is that, the brain, what happens when you're afraid is your executive functions sort of shut down. You can't think straight. We literally cannot think when we're this afraid. People also ask me, it's so much emotional labor. It is so much emotional labor to have these conversations. And granted, there's some bridges that are real big. Don't start with the biggest bridge. I kind of shorten that into you don't have to talk to a Nazi tomorrow, but maybe you talk to a friend who disagrees on something important and you start there. But it's just this idea that in order to bridge, you have to understand that each incremental, every time you ask one more question, every time you hold back from sharing your opinion and instead give the other person just a little more time to give you that material, just how much farther you can go. That gives you the material to actually be creative. But the thing on emotional labor is, again, people say it's so much emotional labor to have the conversation, but I go, but you're doing the math wrong. What you're assuming is that your emotional labor right now is 0, and if you go into these conversations, it's going to jump to a 10. But your emotional labor right now is not 0. We're all walking around really stressed out. And a lot of the stress and anxiety that we feel, the research is indicating, is not founded on correct approximations of what the people we believe are in our way actually believe. So that's not it at all. In fact, what happens is your emotional labor is already up here. And with each conversation you have, when you realize, oh, this is a person with less malevolent reasons for objecting to whatever than I thought, that lowers the emotional labor bit by bit, and it increases your ability to be creative and to see possibilities instead of problems.
Yeah. I want to also be cognizant. I want to make sure that we get questions in, because we'll do a quick closing. Mm-hmm. Please, if you heard anything that you disagree with, that you want to challenge, let us know. As people that are open to curiosity, it would be odd if we built an echo chamber.
This is the Q&A to bring it.
An echo chamber of bridge builders. So we want to hear the challenge. You want to?
Yeah. I mean, I think we wanted to close with a question I get a lot. You probably get it a lot too. But given how dire things do seem, and how powerful polarization and division really is, and how slowly it seems like the right change comes along, where do you find hope? Yeah.
It's a very funny question, because I feel like oftentimes people that talk about hope, we just assume are always hopeful. The secret about being hopeful is that oftentimes you got to fill your reservoirs, and sometimes there isn't a lot to be hopeful about, and that's all right. Acknowledging that helps us understand the situation, diagnose the challenge. the way I think about hope, Monica, in this work, and everybody here is doing some amazing work. I've got Justin in the back who I met yesterday. He does long distance Arctic polar swims. Like,
Dang.
that's insane. You know, we've got folks earlier today that had amazing stories. I know everybody's working on very challenging problem sets. And the challenge is that oftentimes you wake up and you're like, I don't want to do this. I had the option to do a quick shuttle ride in the morning with Devin, who was the guitarist and performer yesterday. And he's like, yeah, dude, I wake up sometimes and I just don't want to perform, you know. And the way I think about hope at this unique moment takes me back to my childhood, when every 2 years I used to move around and I used to meet different folks and meet different, you know, friends. And every 2 years I had to cycle new friendships and I had to build those relationships. And in all of those instances, I remember that really what I was doing was I was creating space for the other to exist. I was sacrificing my sense of self-importance so that I could build a friendship. The process of bridge building was actually my survival strategy. It wasn't some kumbaya thing that I advocated and preached. It was a way of life for me to make friends, for me to build a community around me. Right now, the reason why I lead with so much optimism is because, again, I think that we're living at this moment where we are completely underestimating our ability to make a difference and completely overestimating the power of the loudest voices in our society. Underestimating ourselves, overestimating them. And here's what I mean by them. I'm scared about sometimes using they, them language because what them implies is the other. But here's what I mean. We just came off of our summit in February where we convened hundreds of students across the country, all focused on this mission of bridge building. And we had really conservative students from Texas and Louisiana and very liberal students from New York and California and students from different identities, different demographics, different perspectives, not your generic person that is attracted to this work, all there. And I asked myself, like, why are they all here? Why are they fighting this fight? Why are students leaving 2 days of class to come out to this conference to talk to other people about politics? Sounds like a death sentence. It's because I think that the axis in our politics is shifting. We often think about our politics in left-right terms. Left-right, Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative. But as Taylor said today, he's not pro-Democrat, pro-Republican, he's pro-right. He's pro-doing what helps people. In that summit, our students were on the y-axis. The y-axis is the axis of temperament, of how we show up, our mindset. They were all open to complexity. They cared about being open-minded, not closed-minded. They cared about being empathetic, not exclusive. They cared about creating spaces that welcome people in instead of creating spaces that shut people out. That is the new tent. Because that tent allows us to navigate policy difference and still help solve our challenges and problems. And that's what gives me hope, is because most people are open to nuance and complexity. We just got to create the space for that nuance and complexity.
Exactly.
You want to close this out?
Yeah, I mean, adding to that, there is something, so I mentioned I'm an immigrant. And I think that sometimes folks who were born here don't realize what we have in America. 96% unsolved homicides in Mexico, extraordinary corruption. You know, nobody trusted any elections until the year 2000, even a little, when the one dominant party, the PRI, had been winning for 75 years. I went with my grandmother in Mexico to the voting booth, and she told me on the way, honey, this probably won't matter, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I was like 7 years old going, why'd you do that? Why? Why are we going to vote? And she said, I'm just going to do my part. But she knew that it didn't matter in her country, right? We don't realize how good we have it, you guys. There is something down to our core, in our roots, that is messy and imperfect, but there's something in there to preserve. There's a thread to continue. Braver Angels is called Braver Angels in part because of Abraham Lincoln's note about the better angels of our nature. But in that same speech, he also said that, we'll find our way to build a more perfect union, and the way to do it is with malice toward none, with charity for all, and with firmness in the right. Remember how Taylor said, I'm not Democrat, I'm Republican. I'm for what's right.
Yep.
With firmness in the right. That's what America's all about. we're losing our connections to that, to that persistent. I mean, we've been this divided before, y'all. 700,000 people died in the Civil War. We've come back from that. It sucked, and this sucks, but we can do it, and we come back stronger every time. A more perfect union every time. So a multiracial democracy, we got this. We got this. A democracy that can solve the hardest problems? Heck yeah. We have way more than enough, right? It's about wielding it. It's about being humble enough to wield it and brave enough to wield it. So yeah, I have a lot of hope.
Yeah, it's an act of courage. It's bringing the love and making the collisions happen, as Kyle said.
Yep.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Manu.
Let's open up to questions.
All right.
Yes.
Oh.
Got Mike? Okay. Yes.
Hey guys.
Jeff and I went skiing yesterday.
Yay.
Yesterday.
Adventures.
So I wanted to ask a question about trust, because it seems like kind of part of the way of starting that dialogue is trusting someone to be willing to do that, right? Like you and your parents have such a strong relationship already to be able to see the other side, and that's an incredible foundation to build upon. But that's built over a lifetime, and so for us at this event, you kind of want to do that, but speed up the process of building that trust so that people can bring down their walls to have the conversations. How do we do that, like in such a expedited amount of time? We don't have weekly sessions where we hang out with each other. People are here for 2 days, and then we go back to our lives.
Yeah. So the principle to always keep in mind is that people can only hear when they're heard. They can only hear when they feel heard. So that introduces a sort of frustration into a lot of conversations where people come together and there's not trust. Oftentimes, one of them will think the other has to hear them better, and it has to hear them first, But then they'll think, no, they have to hear me more. They have to hear me first. And so it becomes a reason. It's just like, they don't get me, so I'm not going to get them. Somebody has to be the fool to just listen to the other person without judgment, to do that first. So people can only hear when they're heard. How do you do that in the course of a conversation? One really powerful way I'd encourage everyone to change a very common question is, instead of asking, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you believe this thing that is opposed to my opinion? Why do you blah, blah? Why is a perfectly curious question. It's a beautiful question. But when there's disagreement, it comes off as suspicious and maybe even, judgmental, to the point of what you're really saying is, justify yourself to me. Why should I care about you? Why should I think you matter? Go. And people feel like they're put on trial, right, when tensions are high. So instead of asking, why do you believe what you believe, ask, how did you come to believe what you believe? And another principle that's founded on is, you can't understand why people believe what they believe without at some level knowing who they are. And so it's about that. It's, can you get underneath the issue, this thing that we're fighting about, to just, who are you? What are you about? And curiosity is a form of caring. If I'm interested in you, that feels good. If I'm giving you the chance to just tell me your story, that feels good. And that begins to build the sort of warmth that trust can start to stack up around.
And the other thing about trust is also that we assume that any conversation that we're going to have with somebody is going to be like AOC talking to Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Like, most people that you encounter are like, our caricature of somebody we disagree with is, name your political figure, it's that person. Like, most people are just trying to get by in life, And when you talk to somebody random, like, chances are, even if politics come up, they come up after a series of questions where you're like, how many siblings do you have? What's your family about? Where are you from? What do you care about? It's building those micro bridges that lead to potentially that larger bridge. But every time a college student will ask me, that conversation sounds really scary, I'm like, challenge your assumption that person that you're probably going to talk to is not pick your political figure embodying that. But you're right, trust is difficult to accomplish in a short amount of time, which is why I think our objective with oftentimes bridge building and conversations is to just understand. Like if I can leave a conversation with you and I disagree, if I can at least understand why like you and I disagree or where you're coming from, that's a win in my book. Because that at least helps us understand what is this multicultural democracy. Right here.
I came in a little bit late. You might have touched on this in the beginning, but
What is your name?
my name is Luke.
Luke, okay.
How do you, in the world today, with social media and media, and so much of engagement being based off of reactivity, how do you kind of navigate that like algorithmic snowball challenge? Because it's sort of like what you said, like 10% of the creators create 80% of the content. Like, I feel like that's really fueled the division, and sort of how do you? It almost seems like it's an unbeatable machine at this point, because the more aggressive the reaction, the more engagement, the more dollars. Like, how do you sort of navigate that huge impact that has today?
Sure. So I have two thoughts on this. And your name was Luke, right?
Luke, yeah.
Yeah. So two thoughts on this. One is algorithmic and structural, and the second one is what we as people do. So algorithmic and structural. The fact is that what companies care the most about is attention span and user retention. Like if you're building a business, that's what you care about. If I'm creating a Moon Burger stand, I want you to keep eating Moon Burgers, right? That's my goal. So oftentimes people approach the question of algorithms with, well, we should just be nicer on social media. But the fact is that we know scientifically that oftentimes psychologically we're motivated by the crazy headline. Like, I'm glad that somebody in your neighborhood saved the kitten on the tree, but I care much more about the news story where like something burned down. Like that's interesting and exciting. Like I want to click on that psychologically. So on the algorithmic side, Monica, I often think about how on some of the task forces that we sit on, how can we engineer the algorithms to incentivize productive engagement? So here's an idea that we've run through. On Twitter and on Instagram, you have blue check marks. What if next that blue check mark, you had a green check mark? And that green check mark indicated that this person is productively engaged online, that they share links X amount of time. Suddenly what it does is it shifts the social incentive structure so that you are incentivized to be better in your engagement. Right now we are incentivized to be unproductive. So how do we switch incentive structures? The second piece of this, though, is the individual. Ultimately, I'm the one clicking on the like button. I'm the one sharing. Like that is my choice. I agree with you that they have us beat psychologically, but still I'm sharing. And I think we relegate the amount of agency we have to Mark Zuckerberg instead of ourselves. When we think about content production, content creation, we talk about this to our team all the time. I often bring up the example of the Food and Drug Administration in the 30s and 40s when it was created. The country was awash with consumer food, chips, dirty junk food. And the question was, well, do we ban that junk food? Or is there a way to shift the incentive structures? Somebody said, hey, let's come up with nutrition labels. Let's at least educate the consumer on what they're eating. Nutrition labels didn't just come because Lay's was suddenly good-minded and said, I'm going to put nutrition labels on everything. So it increased the level of transparency. So I think there's an algorithmic question here, and I think there's an individual question. Mm-hmm. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So Sherry Turkle, who's an MIT researcher on conversation and technology, she's amazing. But she talks about how our brains can't be proactive when there's so many demands that they be reactive. So what our technologies have done is constant interruptions to remind us of something new we can be stressed about. It's hard for us to get our curiosity under control and to aim it where we want it to go when there's just so much begging for our attention. I want to focus on what we can do as well. One thing that we don't realize is how absurd and obnoxious it is that we do so much of our talking to each other in spaces where we cannot witness the listening. That's unnatural and weird. I hit post on something. I don't know how many people have read it. I don't know how many of them I know. I have no idea if some of them read it going, ugh. So what then do I assume? I assume the worst, right? As I'm drafting that message, it's like a panopticon. I'm imagining that they're going to judge me in all the ways. It affects what I say. I don't really get the feedback. So what it ends up happening is you end up performing perspectives instead of exploring perspectives on social media. And there's something I call containment that is a trait of conversation that's so important to get right if you're trying to have more productive conversation. More contained the conversation is to the people actually participating in it, the more honest and open people can really be. The more likely you won't just have a proxy culture war that's just grabbing talking points from everywhere else on the internet, right? So there's a proactive, like, take control kind of thing. And then I also think about turning up the dial. I don't remember the last time, I used to do this a lot, no longer do it. If somebody on social media has a beef with something that I've said, and it's starting to get testy, and I know them, or even if I don't, I will always turn up containment. So I will direct message them, right? And that's a one-on-one channel. Or I'll pick up the phone. Or I'll ask if we can get together for coffee, And like, there was one time I did that with my mom, and we ended up in a 3.5-hour conversation about race. And everyone wanted us to get off the phone, and we couldn't. But that was because she had posted something about George W. Bush, and like, we got into it, and then somebody said, pick up the phone. So these platforms are not the places. They are not designed for this. The internet is a non-place that makes us into non-people. We have to be people again.
I want to build on that. I have a question for everybody really quickly. Raise your hand if you've had a conversation with someone that you've actually disagreed with in person in like the last month.
Great question. Nice.
Okay, so wait. Keep your hands raised. Keep your hands raised. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Now, keep your hands up if that conversation ended poorly.
See a few hands.
Just 2?
3.
3. Okay. Oh. Now you can put your hands down. Sorry, I don't mean to stress the tendons in our shoulders. So in this room, there's about 25-ish folks. 16 of us have conversations with somebody that we disagree with in the last month. 3 of those conversations ended poorly. Let's say I don't even buy you. Let's say maybe 6 of those conversations ended poorly, right? Maybe 7 of those conversations. That's still a 50% success rate on conversations. Now, what's fascinating about that, again, is it sounds so small. We're talking about conversation success rates when there's real issues in our society. But that's the myth that we got to break. That no one will ever tell you that. No one, if an alien came and they saw Twitter, there's no way they would say that only 3 conversations across 16 conversations went poorly. And that's what gives me hope, is because this is not the polarization of the masses, it's the extremism on each side. Does anybody else have any questions? I was just so curious. Yes, please.
This has been really helpful.
I think they're trying to record, so there you go.
This has been really helpful to me to just like open new ways of thinking. I'm curious, do you have any tangible like methods or tools beyond maybe the obvious of, learning about someone, or I love the how did you come to believe what you believe, but other ways to kind of progress conversations successfully? Because I would think that's something you guys are great at.
Monica's expert on this. I'm going to defer to her on this question. And Monica won't do this, but you should read her book. I never thought of it that way. Not a paid endorsement. Fascinating read on how to be more curious. You want to close out on that question?
Yeah. So a couple things. One is that research just showed that hedging language is contagious. So what I mean by that is, if you speak your point of view in terms of flexibility, not that you don't have your convictions, but rather, right now, as I understand it, I really feel strongly about X. Instead of, this is the only way it can possibly be, right? If you use that hedging language, more likely, it'll be far more likely that the others in the conversation will too, and that therefore your entire conversation will have more of sort of a growth mindset, of a learning bent. The other really powerful question, and this was very useful in my journalism, is don't ask people what they think about an issue. Ask them what concerns them about the issue. What's great about gathering people's concerns is that it gives your curiosity material, right? So, what concerns you about guns? And they tell you, maybe they tell you about the story when they got mugged. Maybe they tell you about something about their kids in school. Maybe they tell you how they felt about the school shooting. But they give you their concerns. And then after they've given you a couple, you say, okay, what else? And you keep pulling, because what we'll end up doing is, on the surface of any question, we'll answer what we feel is most safe to share, which is what we've heard others say. It takes a couple of rounds for people to get to the stuff that's uniquely them. And once they get to what's uniquely them, more likely it's based on personal experience, which just changes the tone of the conversation. Then you're really speaking as human beings. And then the last tip I'll give is, let's say that you're asking all the questions, and okay, that's getting a little boring. You want to give your own side of things, and you do what's called the pivot, which Braver Angels trains really well on. So you say, thank you for sharing that. I understand X. Thank you. I can see where you're coming from on this. I see it differently, and I tell you what I mean. Instead of, you're wrong, or even, I disagree. That's fine if there's enough trust, but it's even better to say, thank you for that. I see it differently. Can I tell you what I mean? And if you get the other person's buy-in to say yes, all right, now they're far more tuned into what you're going to say, and you can pivot to your story. And that's such a powerful, it just brings down the volume and the heat and brings up the productivity.
Yeah. I know we're out of time, but
Yep.
I was just going to add at Bridge, BridgeUSA, we work with young people across the country. And we have 50 college chapters, 20 high school chapters. And Monica, one of the questions that a lot of students ask us is, this experiment is so, the experiment that is America, it's got a timeline on it. And I remember I was at Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's estate. And we were talking about the fact that in 2026, the United States is going to go through its 250th anniversary.
So close.
250. Now, I'm like 24. To me, that sounds really freaking old. And then for a second, somebody pulled me aside. They said, 250, the Chinese Empire lasts for 1,800 years. The Roman Empire lasts for 1,300 years. Now, those are just empires. Athenian democracy lasts for 450 years. We're not at the end of the American experiment. We're at the beginning. We're like maybe chapter 1 or 2. Depends on how long the books are that you read. It's just getting started. And the reason why we think about it with our students is, as it's just getting started, is because that gives us agency. We're not inheriting, we're pioneering and leading. We're so over time, but this feels like a cool, intimate conversation. So I just want to but thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone. This was
Thank you.
great. Thank you.